Hello everyone! I've got an unexpected review for you today. This wasn't on my to-do list for this year, but here we go! Let's take a look at the 1958 adaptation of A Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens' classic story of people caught up in the French Revolution, starring Dirk Bogarde as Sidney Carton. It's pretty hard to come up with a blurb for A Tale of Two Cities, or really any Dickens novel, that isn't confusing or overwhelming while still conveying sufficient information, but I'll do my best. A doctor named Manette is released after years of labor in the Bastille prison and restored to his daughter Lucy in London. Lucy falls in love with a young Frenchman, Charles Darnay, who's just renounced his aristocratic and abusive kinsman, the Marquis Saint-Evremond. When Charles is accused of treason and put on trial in London, his look-alike lawyer, Sidney Carton, uses the resemblance between them to get the charges dropped. Carton also has feelings for Lucy, but she marries Darnay, unaware of his true identity and the connection between his family and her father. Meanwhile, in France, years of poverty and oppression reach a fever pitch and the revolution begins. The poor rise up against the wealthy and, drunk with newfound power, start chopping off heads at the guillotine. Seeking revenge for past wrongs, a wine seller's wife, Madame Defarge, sets her sights on eradicating the entire family of Saint-Evremond. I've read the book twice, the second time a few years ago. I have this sneaking suspicion that I may have worn this shirt in that video. And I am still kicking myself every time I think of that review for accidentally calling Stryver Striker. I did it multiple times, and I didn't notice, even though I went through that video over and over again while editing it. It wasn't until just a couple hours after I posted it that someone left a comment saying, excuse me, his name is Stryver, and Dickens named him that on purpose! He strives, while Sidney Carton doesn't. I wanted to fix it, but there really wasn't anything I could do, so that moment of idiocy is forever preserved. To date, I have seen 3 adaptations of the novel. The 1935 one I have watched many, many times. There was a period where I was watching it every July 14th, not because I wanted to celebrate Bastille Day, but because Bastille Day was a good excuse to watch the movie again. The 1935 MGM production stars Ronald Colman as Sidney Carton. This was my introduction to Ronald Colman, who many of you know became one of my favorite actors, and if you ask me, he gives one of his best performances, playing one of my favorite characters. That's a tough act to beat, and I give you fair warning, I can't help comparing all other adaptations to that one. Get ready for me to refer to that version a lot in this video. I had seen the 1958 adaptation, which I'll be discussing today, once before, and I watched the 1980 version a few years ago. What distinguishes that one is that Chris Sarandon plays both Charles Darnay and Sidney Carton, putting the ultimate emphasis on the doppelganger theme. I put a link to my mini review of that in the description. I don't remember it especially well. I do remember that going into it I was excited because I thought that the dual casting was going to be great, and then coming out of it I felt like, I haven't yet seen the 1989 adaptation with James Wilby, but I am planning to. I was never really interested in that one before, but I came across a fan edit on YouTube recently that had clips from both 1989 and 1958. It sparked my interest in 1989, and it renewed my interest in 1958. That's why we're here. I looked up a couple scenes to refresh my memory, and then I was like, oh, I'll just watch the whole thing. And then I had thoughts that I wanted to share, and here we are. This 1958 version, directed by Ralph Thomas, is a very good film and a very good adaptation that stays pretty close to the book. Changes are made, of course, to condense the narrative, but it maintains its grand scope while keeping the viewer's focus trained on a manageable handful of characters. It's even got a few things that weren't in the 1935 adaptation, yet it manages to tell the same story in less time. The biggest change is the serious beefing up of Dirk Bogarde's role. I love Sidney Carton. He's been one of my favorite literary characters since I was about 14, so I'm not disposed to complain, But even I think they might have gone overboard, because this Sidney is practically ubiquitous. He's there in the very first scene, riding in the mail coach with Jarvis Lorry, and from that point on, he pops up around every corner. The more Sidney Carton, the better. But for anyone who's read the book, it feels odd for him to appear so frequently. One of the noteworthy things about the character is that despite his importance, Dickens delays his introduction and keeps his subsequent appearances brief for much of the novel. He's one of the periphery characters until he begins to take center stage. Though I do adore Ronald Colman in the role, I do really like Bogart's performance. His take on the clever but completely ambitionless alcoholic legal advocate is very good. He has a charming, dry wit. He tends to be a little more playful with Lucy and Miss Pross, more biting with Charles Darnay. He may use this humor as a shield or as a weapon, whatever the situation calls for, while endeavoring to conceal his more honest, melancholy emotions. His best scene here is the one where he confesses his love to Lucy, betraying himself in a moment of unguarded weakness. Bogart does several little things here that I love, and he may be the only actor who sheds tears during this scene, as happens in the book. Dorothy Tooton's Lucy also gives an appropriately compassionate response. It was watching this scene on its own that made me want to revisit this adaptation. Between this Lucy and Elizabeth Allen's in 1935, I'm not sure who I prefer. I think Dorothy Tooton's is a little more grounded than Allen's, who has a sort of saintly quality, but she does have a tendency to gaze up into Sidney's eyes or cling to him in a way that makes me say, "Lucy, honey, what are you doing? Don't toy with the poor man." Charles Darnay is played by French actor Paul Guers. I worked really hard on that. I hope it came out okay. And while he's less stiff in the role than Donald Woods was in 35, I find him rather unlikable. I don't know, he came across as kind of a jerk sometimes. Also, I believe his dialogue is dubbed, which may be a bit distracting. Since no one else is credited for the role on IMDb, though, he may have just redone his own lines. I suspect someone complained that his accent was too thick. As for other characters, I liked this Jarvis Lorry better. He's played by Cecil Parker, who gave him a little more nuance, so he felt more like a real person than a caricature. I found Athena Seeler's Miss Pross almost equal to Edna May Oliver's. Different, but just as good. Perhaps hers is a better interpretation, but Edna May Oliver is just such a character. Maybe always the same character, but ever entertaining. Fans of the horror genre will be excited to see Donald Pleasance as the memorably shifty Barsad, and Christopher Lee as the Marquis St. Evremond. Physically, he is more threatening and domineering than Basil Rathbone was in 35, though Rathbone nailed the aristocratic sneer. The woman known as the Vengeance is okay here, but this bloodthirsty character is more fun in 1935. Her rusty cackle always reminds me of the old witch in Disney's Snow White. Editing Weaselberry here. The Vengeance in 1935 is played by Lucille Laverne. You know what her top movie is? Snow White! She voiced both the evil queen and the old witch. She reminds me of the old witch in Snow White because she was the old witch in Snow White. Duncan Lamont's Defarge is kind of dull, but Rosalie Crutchley makes up the difference as his wife, the iconic villainess Madame Defarge. It's a slightly different interpretation from Blanche Yerka's. They're both good, but there's something extra creepy about this Madame Defarge. She's so gaunt, she's practically all eyes, and those eyes are full of pure enmity. That reminds me of another change in this version. The timeline is shortened so that Lucy and Charles have been married for only about 6 months instead of several years. They don't have a young child, but she is pregnant. I'm not sure why they made this change, since it doesn't really affect the end result. I can see them arguing that extending the threat to Lucy herself is meant to spur Sidney Carton to action, but that wasn't necessary in the book. They also built up the role of the seamstress. Here she's named Marie, played by Marie Versini, and we see her working as a maid for St. Evremond, talking to Charles, finding the Marquis's body, getting arrested, and seeing Charles again. Sounds like a lot when you list it all out. I don't really have a problem with these additions, and they do emphasize one of the more disturbing and insane aspects of the French Revolution, but at the same time, I think that aspect is conveyed without our seeing more of her. I don't feel like these additions hurt the film, but I don't feel like they add very much either. I personally prefer Isabel Jewell's take on the seamstress. I don't have a specific reason why, I just like her better. I do find the supporting performances vary. Some of them are a little iffy, a little uneven, but others are especially well acted, so it balances out. The ending packs a wallop, as it should, and it doesn't have the added distraction of Christmas music. 1935 ends with the strains of O Come All Ye Faithful, which harkens back to an earlier sequence where Sidney attends church with Lucy and Miss Pross on Christmas. I love this sequence, it's wonderful, it's one of my favorite parts of the movie, but it's not in the book. I have no issue with their musical choice, which underlines the spiritual themes of resurrection, redemption, and regeneration, but I have seen firsthand how it can throw someone off in what should be the story's most powerful moment. It is a bit unfortunate when someone is watching the movie and they're engaged and the ending comes and then all of a sudden they're like, is that a Christmas song? Why are they playing Christmas music? That's weird. The 1958 version has a very good score. The music in the main titles sets the tone, with thrilling instrumentation that represents the mob, contrasting with the effective dramatic theme that becomes more prominent in the film as the tragedy unfolds. I do wonder if some of the nitty-gritty details are clear enough for anyone who is unfamiliar with the plot. I was in the know, but even then there were a couple places where I thought, did they connect all the dots? But if there are some joint pieces left out, there's not much harm done. It's still an enjoyable and successful adaptation. It's a satisfying watch with an excellent lead performance from Bogart, who carries the film. Certain supporting roles may be a bit bland, but others are spot on. And while this doesn't include everything from the book, it includes a lot, and I like many of the changes. Though it doesn't unseat my favorite, there's not much about it that I don't like. Those are my thoughts on this 1958 adaptation of A Tale of Two Cities. I hope you enjoyed this review. I'd love to hear your take on this movie if you've seen it in the comments below, and I hope you'll come back next week to hear what else I saw in May. Thanks for watching.